Right, so this lesson is going to look at linking two topics that we've covered recently and sort of beginning to pull that together. So the first topic, of course, is on databases, which we've been covering in recent weeks, and all the theory around the design, the querying and the use of SQL, as well as a language to manipulate data within databases and create database structures. So linking all of that with the practical exercises that you were doing in relation to Windows Forms and the programming within Visual Studio. Okay, so bringing the two together is really the aim now. In terms of databases, I'm hoping that you can sort of look at a structure like this now, a diagram like this, and it sort of begins to make some sense to you, and you'd feel relatively confident about being able to even program the structure of this table using SQL, and creating the links between, or the relationships between the tables using the primary and the foreign keys, and even being able to write maybe some complex queries for this particular database. So for example, searching by a customer first name and maybe returning the details of all the products that particular customer has ordered, where you'd be relating data across multiple tables. In the previous tutorial, you've looked at using aggregated SQL, where you could, do some calculations of the data and return the results of that, maybe sums or averages or totals and grouping data, etc. So yeah, you've got quite an advanced knowledge now of databases. So we want to begin to tie that in with the actual programming side of things, and that's the aim of this tutorial really. So if to take you back before Easter, one of the final programming tasks that you did in the Year 1 programming book was to read and write data to text files and binary files and so on, CSV files and so on. And one of the last activities you did, you might remember, was this coastal cities task, where you had to create this interface and then be able to update records within this text file, delete records from this text file, and search records and so on. And you remember how clunky that was and how inefficient maybe it felt as well, in terms of having to read all of the data from the text file, loop through the records to find a particular record, creating temporary files if you then wanted to update it, and so on. So hopefully you can see why. And the other thing there, we were only storing a single table's worth of data as well, so it wasn't like we were doing particularly anything fancy in terms of the volume of the data that we were manipulating either. So in that context, hopefully you can begin to see why databases are so important as a kind of a mechanism for storing data. Okay, so the key thing for us now is, rather than linking to text files, we need to be able to create that connection. Ooh, I don't know why I've done that. Create that connection between our programs that we're writing in Visual Studio, and be able to manipulate the data in a database and have that communication occurring. Okay, so that's the aim of the upcoming tutorials. Just a list of some of those database advantages, which make hopefully context in what we've just discussed. So those ability to be able to create those complex queries, I think you appreciate. We did talk a little bit about referential integrity yesterday, the ease at which you'll be able to update the data stored within the database as well, and there are many other advantages of databases too, but some of the ones that are hopefully on that list that you might recognize already. Okay. So up until now, all the SQL that you guys have been writing has really been self-contained, hasn't it, within the actual database itself. So when you've been creating queries, you've just generated those queries, but we haven't actually been, and this is what we want to be able to, we want to be able to kind of send queries from the program to the database and then retrieve that data. Apologies for all these arrows, but retrieve that data and actually manipulate it and play around with it and present it within the actual program itself. Whereas up till now, we've literally just been doing that within the database itself. So that's kind of key to what we're trying to get towards today. One of the things that you need to start thinking about is the actual database software that you're going to use for your projects, and there's lots of different DBMS choices that you could pick from. Okay, I've just highlighted a couple from a wiki here in terms of some of the most popular ones. You'll notice that the Access is on this list. In terms of a sort of a professional standard DBMS software, probably not. Microsoft Access is a good learning aid, but is it suitable for your projects? Well, you could potentially use it, but I would certainly prefer you to look at maybe the more professional MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server. This one, in fact, actually, I think you can find as an add-on for Visual Studio. Okay, but I'm really open. Okay, so if you're already familiar with using Mongo databases, for example, then that potentially could be a choice for you. But there is some investigation for you guys to do there. Other things that you want to think about as well in relation to that is, in your projects, where is the data actually going to be stored? Is the database actually just going to be stored locally on a computer? Because the application doesn't need to sort of share data across multiple devices, or does the actual application that you're thinking of creating, does the database need to be stored centrally or online, so that different computers can connect to it and update and manipulate the data in the database? And one of the things that you also need to consider then is if you are going to have it hosted online or on a server, how are you going to do that? And going and finding out the actual tools that you're going to use. One common development approach is to actually develop the database as a local database, and then sort of almost detach it from the local computer, and sort of move the database to its online host, and then try and figure out a sort of a connection string to hook it back up again to the applications. So definitely think about this now. What I don't want you to do is sort of develop a project where one of the key features of it is an online accessible database. You spend the entire year developing the database in a local setting, and then realize at the last minute you've got complications in terms of making it available centrally. So do some investigation. Databases are going to form part of pretty much every project, I think, in terms of providing that permanent data storage solution. So which one are you going to use? Figure this out now when you've got the time, not when it's 1 month towards the deadline for the project next year. Okay, so just to sort of emphasize that point. Right, so getting back to the actual work for today then, and the work for today is online. I will provide you a link, because I appear not to have done this on the presentation for some reason. So I'll put a link onto the post or within the Sway presentation, so that you can access this folder, and you'll see that you've got a set of video tutorials here that will run you through creating a connection to a database from a Windows Forms application, and I think for now that's what this tutorial focuses on. And then on a lesson later this week, I'll give you a next set of exercises where you can begin to actually create and run those SQL commands from within your application to actually then manipulate the data within the database. The database you need for the tutorial is down here. Okay, so just in case you miss it. And there are some, if you want a little bit more theory and a little bit more information about some of the tools and some of the objects and the classes that you're using here that have been predefined within Visual Studio and C#, then you can get that information there as well. Okay, but in terms of duration, I think this tutorial should take roughly about two hours to complete. So if we equate that to 2 lessons, so that will do for today and tomorrow, and then we'll be back later in the week with a final lesson, and I'll also be talking about the project then as well. Okay, so hopefully this begins to really bring things together.